Hello, my name is Garchompro, and I've been Challengers since Set 2. In this video, I'll be going over my tier list for patch 13.16, as well as covering how to play the best compositions. Looking at my tier list, in S tier, we have Shadow Isles, which is really good, especially if you have the Shadow Isles +1. Bastion Aphelios, which is really good if you have the Bastion +1, but is just a really strong composition if you can manage to get to the Aphelios 2/6 Bastion. Frejlord Aphelios, which is a pretty high rolly composition, but can just win games. Sorcerer Lux/Vel'Koz is really powerful and a really consistent top 4. Invoker Karma is a consistent top 4 if you get to the Shen and can win games with Karma 3. Garen Reroll, which is a pretty consistent way to play if you manage to get an early Garen, and you can tempo it into a Garen 3. And then Challenger Kaisa and Yasuo, which is a strong composition that can be played from a variety of spots, can roll easily on level 7. I'll be covering all of these compositions in depth today. Looking at the A tier, a lot of these compositions I did cover in the last video. Azir Lux is pretty good, especially with buffs to Azir, it's pretty solid. I'm not going to talk about it in depth today, but I did talk about it in my patch 13.15 video, which will be linked in the description. Vel'Koz Sonar reroll for multicaster reroll is pretty solid. There's buffs to Vel'Koz making it a lot better. That being said, you generally want to be playing Vel'Koz in the Sorcerer variation, which I will be talking about in depth, so just go to that if you want to see how to play Vel'Koz. Built different, Prismatic built different, still good. Would not recommend taking Gold built different. Aphelios Gwen is an high roll option of Aphelios. I'll be focusing on the other Aphelios variations, but you can essentially just play the Frejlord variation of Aphelios, dropping out of 2 extra units for Gwen plus Senna, and it works out pretty well. I'll be talking about the Deadeye variation of Aphelios, although it's a bit worse. Rek'Sai reroll is a strong composition, pretty much unchanged from last patch. The Zeri variations are a lot worse because it got nerfed. They're still okay, especially if you play it from Piltover. I did talk about them in my last video, though. Bel'Veth Ahri got nerfed pretty hard this patch. I think it's a lot better to play Aatrox plus Ahri instead of Bel'Veth plus Ahri. Bel'Veth and Ahri just took really big hits. I did talk about this in my last video, though. 8 Void is a solid option if you manage to get like Void online early. If you can get to that Bel'Veth, it's pretty good, especially if you're playing on like a galaxy like Dreaming Pool and you can get like a guaranteed Bel'Veth. It's pretty good, but otherwise it's a little inconsistent if you can't get to that Bel'Veth. But if you manage to get to the Bel'Veth, the 8 Void should usually just be a free top 4. Callista reroll is pretty strong. Typically, I recommend just playing Callista reroll though in Shadow Isles or in a Challenger variation. Especially in the Shadow Isles variation, Callista 3 is very good, although you can opt to go for Callista 3 in Challenger as well. Gwen Azir is a pretty high roll composition where you just run Gwen plus Azir carry. Noxus Darius is still pretty good, especially if you get Darius from an orb. I talked about it in my last video. Kayle reroll is a bit worse after nerfs to Kayle, but it's still pretty strong. Talked about it in my last video. Ionia Kaisa and Yasuo I'll talk about today as another variation of the Challenger Kaisa Yasuo board. And then Demacia, Lux, and Shurima Azir got buffed this patch. Buffs to Demacia and Shurima just make them a lot better, and they've kind of had a resurgence as compositions recently, so I'll be talking about these in depth today. In the A tier and B tier, we just have a bunch of other reroll compositions that aren't necessarily the greatest. The A- tier compositions, though, are all definitely viable if you high roll into them. I usually wouldn't recommend playing the B tier compositions. They're not that great right now. If you super high roll them, they can definitely work out, but usually would recommend steering away from them. The A- ones, though, if you end up high rolling them, can definitely do well. So feel free to play one of these if you end up high rolling it. The first comp I'd like to talk about today is going to be Shadow Isles. If you have a Shadow Isles +1, this comp is just a really consistent top 4. You can play it without a Shadow Isles +1, but you basically need to hit a Senna. If you don't have a Senna, you'd have to play a Viego, and playing Viego for 4 Shadow Isles is not very good. So if you're not sitting there with a Shadow Isles +1 and you don't have a Senna, I'd recommend just going and playing Challengers instead because it's pretty similar. You can even play Gwen in Challengers, as I'll talk about later. But if you hit a Senna, you can opt to play this 4 Shadow Isles version. And then, of course, if you have a Shadow Isles +1, you're going to want to play a board like this. Of course, if you have Shadow Isles +1, you will just simply play this board without the Senna until you hit the Senna. You can just play any unit in this Senna slot right here. I think Aatrox would be the best one, but you can just play, any generic 5 cost should be fine in that slot. If you have a Shadow Isles +1, what you can do is play this 6 Shadow Isles board right here. In this previous board, I was running 4 Challenger with Yasuo and Kaisa and Irelia. Here you're dropping out of the Yasuo and Irelia and simply just opting to play 6 Shadow Isles. This is very powerful. 6 Shadow Isles is just a really strong trait. If you can get to this Senna, this is just going to be a really consistent top 4 board right here. And then, of course, if you have Shadow Isles +2, you're just going to play this board that I'm showing right here, because you'd be hitting 6 Shadow Isles with this. In terms of itemization for this composition, you're basically always going to have Shen as your primary tank. If you have a Shadow Isles emblem, it's always going to be going on your Shen. And Shen's just going to take whatever generic tank items you have. You want it to be as tanky as possible to buy time for your Gwen and Kaisa and Callista to do the damage. In terms of further itemization, Gwen is typically itemized as the carry in this composition. Gwen really wants a healing item +2. She's typically going to be the spark holder in this board because she's going to run into the enemy team and apply spark to all of them. And then she also just likes generic damage items, stuff like Jewel Gauntlet, Titans, Death Cap, Giant Slayer, Guardbreaker, all going to be solid on her. That being said, stuff like Giant Slayer and Guardbreaker I'll typically prioritize on the Callista because I think she uses them slightly better, because Callista does actually utilize the AD from them, whereas Gwen, prefers like your flat AP items. So typically those mixed items I prefer to put on the Callista, whereas the flat AP items will generally be better off on the Gwen. A lot of times, however, people will itemize the Callista before the Gwen. This is just due to the fact that in the early game you have a Callista and you don't have a Gwen, so it's more natural to just itemize your Callista, and then you just start building Gwen items later. So it's really common to go like a 2-3 item Callista before you're building Gwen items, and then start building up that Gwen in stage 4, stage 5 once you have the Gwen, is a completely viable way to do it. Callista's best item for sure is Rageblade in this comp. You're not running like a 6 or 8 challenger, so she doesn't have a ton of starting attack speed, so she's going to ramp up the attack speed really well. On top of that, she's going to really like mixed damage items because she does a lot of physical and AP damage. Of course, she does true damage, not magic, but it scales off of her AP. So stuff like Giant Slayer, Jewel Gauntlet, Guardbreaker, Infinity Edge are all going to be great options because they scale really well off of both AP and AD, or they scale both her AP and her AD. After you've itemized your Gwen and Callista, you can opt to itemize Kai'Sa. Of course, you'd need a lot of items to get to the Kai'Sa, but if you're playing something like Earth and you're taking the like 3-2, 4-2 augments, you may just have a ton of items anyways. So you can just start itemizing the Kai'Sa afterwards. Her best item is going to be Shojin, and then she's just going to like AP items, stuff like Jewel Gauntlet, Guardbreaker, Hand of Justice, Giant Slayer, Death Cap, all that stuff. Hand of Justice is also solid on Callista. I don't necessarily love healing items on Callista in this build. Generally, I do like healing on Callista in like a 6 or 8 challenger board, but with like 4 and 6 Shadow Isles, she's actually tanky enough as like a backline unit. Gwen still wants healing because she's of course going to jump into the enemy team and take damage, but Callista doesn't necessarily care that much, so it ends up being fine on her. I'd say the best legend for this composition is going to be Earth, just because it gives you the highest odds of hitting the Shadow Isles +1, which is, going to be a huge spike. Being able to get into that 6 Shadow Isles is just a lot better than playing 4 Shadow Isles. That being said, outside of Earth, I think Ezreal and Ornn are solid because you have multiple carries you want to stack, and then I also really like Veigar. I think Veigar is a bit better than Ezreal and Ornn for this. Jeweled Lotus is just fantastic. Gwen, Kai'Sa, Callista all love Jeweled Lotus. And then in addition to that, I think Tiny Power is also really good for this composition. So Veigar is another great option to play this. Maybe you hit like a Shadow Isles emblem off of like Placidium Library or something, and you want to go towards this, or you just natural like a Senna at level 8, and you end up playing this with Veigar anyways. One final note is that if you do have AD items, they'll typically be going on your Yasuo. If you're just sitting here with like a ton of swords and you don't know what to do with them, you can make stuff like Deathblade and Infinity Edge, Bloodthirster, Edge of Night on Yasuo. He can also take Titans, but a lot of times you'd prefer to just itemize the Titans on Gwen. If you're really just primarily stacking the Yasuo though, you're probably better off just playing like a 6 Challenger variation. So typically you won't be stacking Yasuo in this build because you generally just want to be stacking the Gwen Callista because of the Shadow Isles units, and then Kai'Sa is going to enjoy the extra frontline from the Shadow Isles. So Yasuo is generally not the best in this board, but can work if you have spare 80 items and a Yasuo too. The next composition I have is going to be Bastion Aphelios. The idea of this board here is you're going to be running 6 Bastion, giving you as much frontline as possible with a Rageblade Aphelios, and letting him scale up that damage throughout the long fight. You do need at least 1 Rageblade for this comp to work. 2 Rageblades is actually ideal, but you can get away with only 1. And in terms of other items on your Aphelios, Titans is really good because you're going to be able to stack it up relatively quickly with the Rageblade. In addition, I think that Gunblade is really good because it's going to help keep your frontline really stable throughout the long fight. And in addition, Giant Slayer, Deathblade, and Guardbreaker are all solid items on Aphelios. Infinity Edge is okay. I think it's a bit worse than the others, but it's definitely an acceptable option if you're low rolling your items. You want to be primarily tank itemizing your Shen. Taric can take your extra tank items and then also holds your Redemption. Cassante will typically hold like whatever mana item you can get your hands on. That'll typically be Vow, Chalice, or Blue Buff. You can throw extra tank items on Cassante though if you manage to hit him. I wouldn't plan for itemizing Cassante in this board usually because you're not going to always be able to reliably hit him. But if you can get to Cassante, it is worth itemizing him because with 6 Bastion, he's going to be extremely tanky. One note with Bastion though is you typically want to be prioritizing tank items that are giving you stats that aren't armor and magic resist. So stuff like a Warmog's, Redemption, those are going to be a bit better than stuff like a Bramble or a Dragon's Claw or a Stoneplate. I actually think Bramble's still pretty good though, just due to the fact that being able to negate crit damage is really powerful. A lot of people are building stuff like Jewel Gauntlet anyways, so Bramble's still definitely a solid option in this composition, but something like a Stoneplate's a lot worse. In terms of this board here, of course, I'm just playing the 6 Bastion. This assumes that you hit a Cassante. I'll go over what will happen if you don't hit a Cassante and what will happen if you have a Bastion +1 in a minute. This Heimerdinger slot here is really just a flexible spot. The ideal units to play here are just going to be one of the legendaries. Typically, it'll be Heimerdinger, Senna, Ryze, or Aatrox. So whichever one of those you hit, you'll typically just be playing in that slot right there. If you manage to hit a Bastion +1, one common variation is to play the Gwen. Gwen's going to be nice because Gwen has natural synergy with the Maokai, giving you 2 Shadow Isles. And then, of course, she's going to be able to hold our AP items because we don't really have a great AP item holder anyways. So you can throw Bastion on the Gwen and then secondary itemize her as your secondary carry. Another variation that's common is to throw Bastion on an Aatrox. Bastion Aatrox is going to be super tanky. He's going to live super long. You go a healing item +1 on him, so something like, maybe Deathblade plus Bloodthirster, and he's going to live a really long time and just output a ton of damage. If you don't have a Bastion +1, of course, you are forced to hit a Cassante in order to play the 6 Bastion board. If you don't manage to hit a Cassante, I would recommend playing a variation something like this with a 3 Frejlord. I would recommend, though, dropping out of the Kassadin and Maokai into like just a normal Frejlord Aphelios board, like I'll talk about next. So I would recommend transitioning out of this, but this is definitely something you can play if you're like rolling down trying to hit the Cassante and you don't manage to hit it. You can play this for the meantime. In terms of the best legend for this composition, I think that the best one is going to be Urf or Vladimir. Urf just because it enables you to hit Bastion +1 more reliably, which means that you're not forced to hit a Cassante for you to be able to play this board. And then, of course, if you get Bastion +2, playing 8 Bastion is extremely powerful. Your units are just not going to die. And then Vladimir is also really good because Transfusion has really good synergy with this composition. The Bastion units already have a lot of armor and magic resist, so Transfusion is going to scale up their HP, and you're just going to be indexing into multiple different stats. In addition, Ascension is also really good in this comp because, again, you have super tanky frontline. Your damage is backloaded anyways with the Rageblade Aphelios, so Ascension is just a fantastic option in this composition. There are variations of Bastion that don't run Aphelios. You can theoretically run something like Senna plus Zeri and carry the Zeri instead of the Aphelios, but it's a lot worse than the Aphelios version. In addition, there is variations where you run Azir and you go like Rageblade, Archangels, Azir. I do think it's worse than the Aphelios version. I think it's a bit better than Zeri, so you can like drop the Aphelios for Azir, and just go like Rageblade, Archangels +1. This is somewhat acceptable, but it's definitely a weaker variation. The next comp I have is going to be Frejlord Aphelios. The core of this board here is going to be Aphelios plus the 3 Frejlord units and then a Bruiser unit. And then we end up just filling it out with Shen and Taric for extra frontline, and then Soraka here to give us the 3 Targon to make our Shen, Taric, Sejuani just have a bunch of extra shields. If you manage to get to Senna though, you can replace the Soraka with Senna, and Senna is going to be a bit better. In terms of itemization, you want to primary itemize your Aphelios here. He needs a Rageblade +2. The best item on his +2 is going to be Deathblade, but Giant Slayer, Guardbreaker, Infinity Edge, and Gunblade are all going to be acceptable options as well. Titans is also a fine one too. You're typically going to be throwing your tank items on Sejuani. You want to make sure that you have proper tank items with this comp because we do need to give Aphelios a bit of time to scale throughout the fight. So you want stuff like, like Warmog's Bramble, Dragon's Claw, Stoneplate, not necessarily stuff like Sunfire on this comp. And then you can itemize the Shen, however, if you hit Shen 2 before Sejuani 2, so keep that in mind. You can also throw, Morello on Ashe. She's a great Morello user. She's going to hit most of the board and just apply that because Morello now works on AD units. And then you can, of course, always throw tank items on Scion if you manage to hit him. I wouldn't plan around hitting a Scion. If you don't have the Scion, you can simply just play a Bruiser unit instead. But if you do manage to hit Scion, you can definitely consider putting tank items on him once you have your Sejuani filled out right here. Comparing this to the Bastion version, this composition is a lot more expensive. We just have a lot of high-cost units here. That being said, unlike the Bastion version, you're not forced to have like a Bastion +1 or a Cassante, because you can make do without the Scion here, essentially just play a Bruiser instead. And yeah, this is just the board right here. One variation you can play is the 4 Deadeye version. If you happen to hit like an Urgot 2 on rolldown, you may consider playing this. You want stuff like Hand of Justice, Titans, and Bloodthirster on your Urgot, and you kind of have this Urgot Aphelios dual carry, with Urgot being like a pseudo tank. That being said, after the Urgot nerfs, I do think this is a lot worse, so I definitely don't prefer this composition, but sometimes you will end up playing it if you just hit an Urgot 2 on rolldown, whereas this variation typically is just a lot stronger in the late game. But a 4 Deadeye variation is actually great to stabilize at level 7, so sometimes if you're rolling down for Aphelios at level 7, you may end up just playing 4 Deadeye. A lot of times you might get stuck in 4 Deadeye. Again, you could just play this board here without the Shen and you play a Bruiser over the Scion. You may get stuck in 4 Deadeye, but if you have the money, I do recommend trying to transition into a board something like this, because it's just going to cap out a lot higher. I think the best legend for this comp is going to be Master Yi. Aphelios really likes pumping up. He just likes attack speed. It's his favorite stat. So pumping up is just great, so I think Master Yi is going to be the best. One other item that I forgot to mention that's also pretty solid on Aphelios is going to be Rapid Fire Cannon. It's definitely a lot worse than Rageblade, but it is an acceptable substitute if you need an item, because, sometimes you just don't hit a Rod, and he really does want like an attack speed item, so Rapid Fire Cannon can be a solid option. The next comp I have is going to be Sorcerers. Sorcerers is really good this patch, especially with buffs to Vel'Koz. It smooths it out during the mid game a lot. You're really stable on like level 6, level 7 with it, so I think it's just a really strong and consistent composition right now. The idea of this board here is you're just playing 6 Sorcerer plus 3 Demacia, and you want to be giving the Demacia item to your Lux. If you happen to have a Sorcerer +1, you'll typically throw it on the Sona, and then you'll drop this Malzahar right here, typically for just a Shen. And this will just be your board. Of course, you'll just play whatever Sorcerer until you hit the Ahri. In terms of itemization, I actually have been itemizing Vel'Koz before the Lux a lot right now. It's just due to the fact that you can reliably hit Vel'Koz 2 pretty early. A lot of times you'll have Vel'Koz 2 at like 3-2 if you roll then, but even not, if not, you can hit like Vel'Koz 2 at 4-1, and he's going to do a lot of damage, and then you can throw your extra items on your Lux later. That way you're not forced to hit Lux 2 at 4-1, because last patch you kind of a lot of times were forced to hit Lux 2 at 4-1. This patch, however, you're actually pretty stable on Vel'Koz 2 Lux 1, so it ends up working out pretty well at level 7. Of course, your level 7 board will simply just be this without the Shen. If you don't have the Sorcerer +1, typically just have to play this board right here at level 7, and this will generally just be what you're playing. Again, I'll primary itemize by Vel'Koz. He wants a mana item +2. I think Shojin is the better of the mana items, but blue buff is fine. But if you have a blue buff, you typically want to be throwing it on your Lux. +2, Jewel Gauntlet's going to be his best one. Guardbreaker, Giant Slayer are great as well. And then I think Gunblade is good as well. You can even go something like Hand of Justice if you have like Jeweled Lotus, but I typically wouldn't make that item if I don't have Jeweled Lotus. Then you also want to make sure that you have Lux items. Lux really wants a mana item. Blue buff is going to be the best. Shojin's going to be the second best. And then Jewel Gauntlet's going to be her next best item. Gunblade is her next best item after that. And then after that, I think Giant Slayer and Guardbreaker are acceptable as well. The other item that you really want to make sure you have, and the most important item for this composition, is going to be a Spark. I typically will just throw it on my Swain. I like to have my Swain on the same side as my Lux. That way I can guarantee that the Lux is hitting the same target as the Swain, and she's just getting the full Spark value. You can throw whatever random tank items else you have on the Swain. If you have a Vow, I typically will throw it on the Jarvan. But other random tank items will generally just go on Swain. This comp doesn't necessarily need tank items that much. This is one composition, though, where ZZ Rot's actually a pretty good item. If you see a ZZ Rot, you basically always want to make it because Bow and Belt don't really do that much for this board. So it ends up working out pretty well. With this board, it's actually pretty good to roll on 3-2. If you have like a lot of pairs or you like lose streaks in the early game and you want to just stabilize, you can roll at level 6. A board like this is really powerful. You can usually just win streak during stage 3 with this. So feel free to roll 3-2 at level 6 for a board like this, and then transition to a board like this at level 7. And then, of course, just at level 8, go into Ahri, and then, drop into the 6 Sorcerer like so. If you have Sorcerer +2, I highly recommend playing 8 Sorcerer. It's just really powerful. I don't really like playing 8 Sorcerer without Sorcerer +2, just due to the fact that you're going to have to play Malzahar and Orianna, which just makes your board a bit weaker than it could be. So if I just have a Sorcerer +1, I end up just playing a board like so. If you can get to Vel'Koz 3, it's a fantastic win condition. If you're sitting there with a lot of Vel'Kozes at level 7, like 6-7 Vel'Kozes, feel free to just stay for Vel'Koz 3. Otherwise, I do prefer to go to level 8, because if you don't have a Sorcerer +1, your board doesn't really fit at level 7. So getting to level 8 and being able to get Lux 2 with the 3 Demacia is a huge power spike. If you manage to get to Ahri 2 before you have Vel'Koz 3, you can transfer items off of Vel'Koz onto Ahri. Ahri 2 is going to be great. Ahri 1 versus Vel'Koz 2 is actually pretty similar in my opinion. There's not necessarily that much of a power gap. So a lot of times I just end up throwing my spare items on the Ahri. But again, this board, we're really not prioritizing tank items that much. So a lot of times you'll actually get to the late game and you'll have like a 3-item Lux, 3-item Vel'Koz, and like 2 or 3-item Ahri, especially due to the fact that Lux only needs 2 items because she has the Demacia. My favorite legend with this composition is definitely Veigar. Veigar is just great. Jeweled Lotus is fantastic. As you see here, Jewel Gauntlet is just the best item to be putting on your carries in this composition. And if you have Jeweled Lotus, you don't have to be making Jeweled Gauntlet. So Veigar is just great. Veigar's other augments aren't really good for this board. I don't think the Tiny Power is great in Sorcerers because they already have a lot of AP. But being able to just have that Jeweled Lotus is really powerful. The next composition I have is going to be Invokers. Invokers didn't really get nerfed in the patch at all, so it's still a very strong composition. You can win the game a lot of the times if you get Karma 3, and as long as you hit 1 Shen, it should be a pretty consistent composition that can get a lot of top 4s as well. The idea of this board here is we're running 6 Invoker with Karma and Shen as the carry and tank respectively. Karma is going to be your primary carry, and Shen is going to be the primary tank. This composition does really need Shen. If you don't have a Shen, the board kind of falls apart. You won't have enough frontline. You're not going to be able to get that 6 Invoker. So generally what's common is to roll at level 7 for at least 1 Shen, even if you could potentially go level 8. Once you hit 1 Shen and Karma 2, you're usually stable at level 7. And then at that point, you can decide whether or not to go level 8. I'll typically go level 8 if I already have a Karma 3 or if I'm contested. Or I just don't think I have enough money to hit Karma 3. Maybe I'm only sitting here with 3 Karmas and barely enough money to go level 8. I might just push level 8 and try and get a guaranteed power spike there by putting in an extra unit. Otherwise, I'll typically stay level 7 going for Karma 3 because Karma 3 will usually be a bigger spike than anything you can hit at level 8. Your standard level 7 board will just be this without the Ahri, and then you'll simply just be playing Cassiopeia instead of the Rise. If you have an Invoker +1, of course, your level 7 board can be essentially just this right here, because of course you wouldn't have the Rise, and you'll just play whatever Ionia unit you have instead of the Ahri. Once you end up getting to the Rise, you typically just drop the Galio, and you'll usually drop the Galio for some sort of legendary unit. The best ones are going to be Senna and Heimerdinger. Senna is actually really good because you have the 2 Targon, so her shields are going to be even better. You can also throw in Aphelios as well. It's going to buff up your frontline a bit. In terms of itemization, your most important unit is going to be Karma. Gunblade is her most important item. Gunblade is going to allow your frontline to sustain itself really long. Your frontline has a lot of shields, but they don't necessarily heal themselves. So Gunblade has really good synergy with units that shield themselves, because they'll shield themselves, buy some time for Karma to heal them up with a Gunblade, and then they'll be ready to get another cast off with their full HP. Karma then wants 2 damage items. Deathcap, Jewel Gauntlet, Archangels, Giant Slayer, and Guardbreaker are all great options on her. Then you want to make sure that you have tank items on your Shen. Bramble is going to be his best tank item, but there's a bunch of other ones that are going to be good. Warmogs, Dragon's Claw, Stoneplate, Redemption, Vow are all good options. He's also generally going to be your Spark Holder. If you have a 3-item Shen, you can opt to throw a Redemption on your Taric. Taric can take supplementary tank items, but Redemption is really good because you're just throwing him in the middle of the front line. Lysandra will typically be taking your Chalices and Morello. Morello is really good in this composition because you don't necessarily like kill things super quickly. You have really stally fights, so preventing enemy units from being able to heal back up is really powerful. And Lysandra applies Morello really well. You can also go Sunfire. You're not forced to have anti-heal in this comp, but it is very strong. And then if you do end up building Chalices, they'll typically go on Lysandra, because that way she'll walk up and you won't clump around like this. And then of course she enjoys the mana because with 2 Chalices she should be able to instant cast. You want the Lysandra on the same side as your Karma, of course. That way you can give the damage amp from her ability to your Karma. One other note with this composition is it is a comp where you can roll on level 6. Ideally, you would only be rolling on level 7, though, because you have much higher odds of hitting Shen, which is the most important unit to hit. But if you know you're low rolling in the early game, you can reliably roll at 3-2 and roll for a board something like this with the 4 Invoker plus the Taric Kassadin. You can also drop the Taric Kassadin for 2 Ionia units, so something like Set plus Irelia would also be fine. And then you can also theoretically drop out of the 4 Invoker for the 2 Ionias. So you can, drop for like Irelia, and then, like Jhin or Set or something off this Cassiopeia slot. And this is also an acceptable board at level 6. And so it's pretty cheapish to hit at level 6, and you're using most of these units later, so it ends up being pretty fine to roll for this. In terms of an Invoker emblem, you typically want to be putting it on Ahri ideally. It's decent on something like a Senna, but it's going to be best on Ahri here. Until you hit the Ahri, you can simply just throw it on whatever other Ionia unit you have. A lot of times I'll just be running like a Yasuo 2 until I hit Ahri, then I drop Yasuo 2 for Ahri 1. And Invoker on Yasuo is actually pretty solid. You can put Invoker on Taric, but it is a little awkward because you generally want to sell the Taric later to put it on Ahri. But I do think it is pretty solid to put Invoker on the Taric. In addition, another option you can go for is you can go for Taric 3 in this build. If you're just swimming in a ton of Tarics, you can opt for Taric 3 and just primary tank itemize him. And that's going to work out. Lysandra 3 isn't that important in this build. Don't go for Lysandra 3 if you don't have the money, but if you're high rolling, you can definitely go for it, and she's going to be putting in a good amount of work. I think the best legend for this composition is going to be Veigar. This comp really enjoys the Jeweled Lotus. You have a bunch of units in this backline that are going to be doing a bunch of damage, so not having to go for like the Jewel Gauntlet on Karma makes your life a lot nicer. You have that extra damage immediately, so you can kind of prioritize some tank items more than having to prioritize your damage items on your Karma. In addition, I think Tiny Power is also quite good in this comp. Being able to just get some extra AP is pretty solid. It's not the most broken augment, but it's pretty solid for the composition. In terms of Rise, most of the Rise abilities are going to be good with 6 Invoker. I mean, the thing is, like, with this comp, you're always going to be playing the Rise anyways. I think Frejlord is really good, but there's a bunch of Rises that are solid. Realistically, though, just play Rise with whatever in this composition. Even the ones that are generally considered a little bit weaker, stuff like Vandal City, is still great with 6 Invoker. He's going to be casting enough that it's going to do a lot of work. The next composition I have is going to be Garen Reroll. This comp is really strong if you get like a Garen from Orb with a healing item, and you can just win streak during the mid game with Garen. This comp's a lot better this patch due to buffs to 7 Demacia as well as buffs to Garen. So it ends up being a pretty good composition now. What you want to do is make sure you have a healing item on your Garen. Bloodthirster is going to be best. Hand of Justice can work, although it's a bit worse than Bloodthirster. And then you want +1 on him. The best +1 is going to be Titans, but Rageblade is a solid option as well. This is going to be your standard level 7 board, and you're just going to be rolling at level 7 until you hit Garen 3. Then you can push for level 8. After you itemize the Garen, you want to get some AP items on your Lux because she's going to be your secondary carry, and you generally want to be throwing whatever tank items you have on your Nasus, because he'll be your primary tank here. You can also throw spare tank items on your Jarvan. You actually end up being able to itemize a bunch of units in this because you have Demacia, so your units really are only taking 2 items each anyways, so you end up actually being able to itemize like 4 units a lot of the time. Once you hit Garen 3, you can push for level 8, and at that point you can drop Teemo and play either 7 Demacia or 4 Juggernaut. 7 Demacia is a little weird because you'd have to be playing Kayle and Poppy. I think the 7 Demacia is a better trait than the 4 Juggernaut, but it might be hard to find the units. So 4 Juggernaut, is a bit easier to find because the units are a bit higher cost. That being said, this comp is really strong if you have Demacia +1 because you can play a board like so. On this board here, you want to be giving your Demacia items to Garen, Lux, Jarvan, and then usually the Nasus. You can also give it to the Sona, but if you have a Demacia emblem like so, I would recommend just giving it to the Nasus here because he's going to use the tank item a bit better than Sona will be able to use her item. And then on this board, you of course want to be giving your Demacia item to Garen and to Lux. There's other variations of Demacia, but I'll cover those in the Demacia Lux section instead. This here is really just focusing on the Garen Reroll variation. And yeah, this is really strong if you have good early tempo, stage 2, stage 3 with the Garen. Garen with like a Bloodthirster, Garen 1 with 5 Demacia is really powerful during stage 3. So you should be able to save a lot of HP and then transition into this comp and a lot of times just win the game. I think the best legend for this composition is going to be Master Yi. Master Yi is really good because pumping up is great. Garen scales really well off of attack speed. So being able to give that to Garen is fantastic. And then in addition to that, I also think that Gotta Go Fast is amazing with Garen. Garen will ult and then kind of move slowly towards enemies after he kills them during his ult, but Gotta Go Fast will remove any of that and he'll be able to just dash to nearby enemies, and you're basically not having that downtime with his ultimate. Urf is also pretty good because the Demacia +1 makes this comp a lot better. Of course, you don't have the potential to get something like Gotta Go Fast, but being able to get that Demacia +1 is really powerful because the comp is a lot easier to play at level 7 with the +1. The next composition I have is going to be Challenger's Yasuo plus Kai'Sa carry. This is a pretty consistent composition right now because you can hit it pretty easily at level 7. Usually just hitting a Yasuo 2 or a Kai'Sa 2 should be enough to be stable at level 7. Then you can go level 8. It's also really good if you have a Challenger +1. You know, Urf is super popular right now. So if you have a Challenger +1, being able to drop the Samira is really good, but it's honestly quite playable without the Challenger +1. The most important thing is just making sure that you have combat augments with this composition. You want to just make sure that you have, 2-3 combat augments to make sure that your units are doing a lot of damage. Otherwise, your Yasuo and Kai'Sa are going to be lacking a bit in that department. In terms of itemization here, I think the most important unit is going to be Yasuo. Yasuo's best item is going to be Edge of Night by far, and then I think his next best item is Titans. In terms of your +1, I really like Bloodthirster on this comp, especially because I typically will go like double, triple damage augments. Like I'll go stuff like Jeweled Lotus, Tiny Power, Social Distancing, etc. So I usually am not lacking in the damage department with my 6 Challenger Yasuo. That being said, you can also go like Infinity Edge or Deathblade here instead of the Bloodthirster if you're lacking a bit more damage. Double Titans is also definitely good. After Yasuo, you want to itemize your Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa's best item is going to be Shojin. I think if you're 6 Challenger, you don't need Shojin, although it is still a very good item. After that, she likes just AP items. Jewel Gauntlet, Hand of Justice, Giant Slayer, Guardbreaker, Deathcap are all good. Archangels isn't great in this variation because your fights tend to be a little quick with the 6 Challenger, although it is an okay option. After the Kai'Sa, I would itemize the Shen because he's going to be your primary tank here, and he's just going to take whatever tank items you have. You can also opt to itemize the Gwen here. If you hit like a Gwen 2 on your level 7 roll down, feel free to throw the AP items on her instead of the Kai'Sa, especially if you have a Challenger emblem. Typically what I'll do at level 7 is I'll just throw the Challenger on the Gwen and then drop the Samira, and that'll be my level 7 board. Of course, if I don't have a Challenger emblem, my level 7 board will just be this board, but without the Gwen. This would be like a level 7 board with the Gwen. You can start throwing just random AP items on her or a healing item. And then if you have the Challenger +1, when you get to level 8, what you'll typically just do is throw in an Aatrox ideally, because of course he's going to synergize well with the traits, and then his Darken is also going to be really nice. If you can get the Darken onto like your Yasuo, it's just going to give the Yasuo extra healing, extra HP, which he's really going to enjoy. That being said, you can also just throw in a variety of different legendaries, and a lot of times what you'll end up doing is you'll actually end up dropping out of this Gwen here to throw the Challenger on something better. The best holders of Challenger are going to be the legendary units. So an ideal board would look something like this here. Challenger Aatrox is really good. You can get 3 items on your Aatrox, especially if you get to Aatrox 2. Challenger Aatrox outputs a ton of damage. Challenger Senna is also a really good option. She's going to be ulting a lot and just shielding your entire team. In addition to that, Challenger Heimerdinger is also quite good. And then Challenger Belveth is another option. I like it a bit less than the other ones, but it definitely does work out. So those are generally going to be the best Challenger holders outside of Gwen. If you have Challenger +2, you'll want to play the board that I was showing previously and just essentially play 8 Challenger. 8 Challenger is super powerful. I think it's pretty much always worth playing if you have the Challenger +2, and it's a pretty cheap composition, so you should be able to reliably top 4, assuming you just hit a Yasuo 2 or a Kai'Sa 2. If you have an Ionia +1, you can opt to play a 6 Ionia variation, something like this. I generally prefer just to play the Challenger variation if I don't have any +1s. I think 6 Challenger without Challenger +1 is better than 6 Ionia without Ionia +1. But with Ionia +1, you can opt to play a board something like this here. And this Aatrox slot can be either Aatrox, Senna, Heimerdinger, or Belveth. They'll typically just be your Ionia emblem holder. You can put Ionia on the Kai'Sa, but I think she uses it worse than the other legendaries. So generally, I would prefer to hold out and get it onto one of those 4 legendaries that I just mentioned, because they're going to be using it the best. In terms of the best legend for this composition, there's a few that are solid. I really like Veigar. I think Jeweled Lotus and Tiny Power are pretty good with this composition, enabling them to get a bunch of extra damage. Urf is also fantastic. Challenger and Ionia +1 are both great options. So being able to play into one of those 2 is great. And also if you get, a Shadow Isles +1, you can play into the Shadow Isles comp that I talked about earlier. It shares a lot of the same units, so you can kind of flex between those. So Urf is really good for this composition. I think legends that give items are also pretty solid, just because you have multiple units you want to itemize here. Although I do prefer the aforementioned ones. And I think Vladimir's Transfusion is also pretty good because your comp does lack a bit of tankiness. so being able to get the transfusion for the board is pretty good. The next comp I have is going to be 7 Demacia. I usually only recommend playing this comp if you have a Demacia +1. If you don't have a Demacia +1, it's going to be a little bit awkward. Of course, you can just play the board above, but with a Demacia unit instead of the Nasus, you'd just be playing the Kale. It's going to be a lot worse though because your unit quality is a lot lower, so I do only usually recommend playing this with Demacia +1. If you want to play around Lux without the Demacia +1, you can play the Sorcerer board like I talked about earlier, or you can play this Lux Azir board like so. It's pretty high rolly composition. You need, to have Lux 2, Azir 2, and Nasus 2 to be strong, but it's going to be a stronger variation typically than these comps right here if you don't have the Demacia +1. That being said, with the Demacia +1, what you'll typically want to do is you actually dual carry the Lux, Garen, and Azir here. Because we're running Demacia, we can actually have 4 3-item units really easily. And the thing to note is that I do have items on Garen. This is different than the Garen Reroll, because in the Garen Reroll, we were staying on level 7, going for Garen 3. In this comp, however, what we're doing is we're just getting Garen 2 at level 7, and then we're pushing for level 8 to fit this board here. The difference is that we're not forced to hit Garen 3, but he's not going to be our primary carry in the late game, but he will be the primary carry in the mid game. You can obviously run these Demacia variations without Garen as an extra carry, but I do think he smooths over your mid game a lot, which is why I like running him with these items here. You could simply just, itemize like the Jarvan and Nasus instead of the Garen, though, if you opt to not have this Garen with these items. Garen, of course, is just going to want Bloodthirster +1, either being Titans or Rageblade typically. We do want to primary itemize our Lux. Lux wants either blue buff or Shojin +1. In this board here, though, I do like to go for like Jewel Gauntlet, Giant Slayer, or Guardbreaker to give a bit of extra damage. Gunblade is another good option, especially if you happen to have like some sort of, damage augment, like something like Jeweled Lotus. You can just opt for a blue buff Gunblade and you should be doing good enough. Azir's going to be taking your supplementary damage items. Rageblade and Shiv are going to be his best ones, but Gunblade, Jewel Gauntlet, Deathcap are going to be good on him as well. Giant Slayer, Guardbreaker are fine as well. You can put the Demacia on your Azir and have him take the Demacia item. It's a little awkward because you essentially only get a 2-item Azir this way. So if you're sitting here swimming in a lot of damage items, you can opt to Demacia the Nasus and have him be your primary tank in that scenario. But a lot of times you won't have enough damage items to do that, so you may just opt to go Demacia on Azir. That way you can get an extra damage item, that way you have enough damage. But if you can get to a 3-item Azir, I would recommend just putting it on the Nasus. Another variation you can go is you can actually go for Vel'Koz 3 with this. And same thing with the Azir. If you have 3 Vel'Koz items, just go 3 items on your Vel'Koz. Otherwise, you throw the Demacia on the Vel'Koz to guarantee that you get that Radiant item on him. And yeah, in this variation, we're primary itemizing the Lux and Vel'Koz. A lot of times you can just stay level 7 here, go for Vel'Koz 3. You can potentially also go for Garen 3 while you're doing it. And then it becomes kind of like a hybrid variation of the Garen Reroll composition, where you go Vel'Koz 3, Garen 3. Vel'Koz 3 is really powerful. And so if you're playing into the, Demacia variation and you just go to like level 8 or whatever, or level 7, and you're sitting there with just a lot of Vel'Kozes, you can opt to go for the Vel'Koz 3. I think the Azir 2 variation is going to be better on Azir 2 versus Vel'Koz 2, but if you can manage to hit the Vel'Koz 3, this is going to be really powerful. And then yeah, like I said here, if you don't have the Demacia +1, I recommend playing some sort of Lux Azir variation like this if you're trying to play around Lux plus Azir. I think the best legends for this composition, Urf is going to be really good, of course, because it enables you to hit the Demacia +1. I also quite like Veigar because Jeweled Lotus just works really well for this composition. Also, Tiny Power is pretty good because you don't have a lot of flat AP, AD, or attack speed or anything. Like Garen scales off of all of those really well. Lux is going to utilize the AP, Azir will utilize the attack speed AP, and because we're really just running a defensive trait in Demacia, you don't really have those stats innate, so I think it ends up working out quite well. In terms of the units you want to be giving the Demacia item to, you always want to be giving it to Lux, you always want to be giving it to Jarvan, and then if you're itemizing the Garen, you want to give it to Garen. If you're not itemizing Garen, you'll typically just give it to Sona, and then whichever of the 2 units you end up putting the Demacia emblem on, same thing in this variation as well. The final comp I have for today is going to be 7 Shurima. Shurima got buffed as well as Azir, so it's had a bit of a resurgence, and it's a pretty solid composition currently. The idea of this board here is we're going to primary itemize our Azir with Nasus with our tank items, and then we're going to secondary itemize our Akshan as the secondary carry. In terms of items, Azir's best item is going to be Rageblade, and then you want +2. The reason we're going Rageblade in this build here is because 7 Shurima ends up being really tanky and stalls out fights a lot, so ramping up with the Rageblade is really good. In terms of the +2, really good ones are going to be Shiv, Gunblade, Archangels are great, and then Giant Slayer, Guardbreaker, and Deathcap are solid as well. Again, Archangels is good as Rageblade for the same reason, you end up having longer fights, so it works out really well. If you can manage to, you want to throw Shiv on an extra unit that isn't the Azir, because you'd ideally have 3 items on Azir, but a lot of times the item economy just doesn't really work out that way, and so you end up just putting the Shiv on Azir. It's completely fine. Nasus wants to take your tank items. With 7 Shurima, he's extremely tanky. So yeah, just throw whatever tank items you have on Nasus, and then typically you'll just throw whatever spare AD items you have on your Akshan. You can manage to go for Akshan 3 sometimes, but generally speaking, I would focus on just getting to level 8 and getting Azir 2 Nasus 2 because they're going to be the more important spikes. But if you hit a lot of Akshans, feel free to go for Akshan 3, and that can be a potential win condition for you. or just running the drive-in here for the strategist. If you happen to have a Shurima +1, what you're going to do is drop either the Talia or the Cassiopeia typically, and you'll usually just replace it with a legendary unit. Aatrox is a great option, giving the Juggernaut for the Nasus makes it a lot tankier. In addition, Senna is just a great one. She works really well in this composition. Rise is another solid option, giving Invoker with the Cassiopeia. It works out pretty well. And then you can also run Scion, Bruiser with the Renekton is a lot of frontline that way as well. So generally, you just want to be replacing it with one of those legendaries. Heimerdinger is another great one too. Just one of those 1-star legendaries is going to be the best addition to this composition. For the best legend, I think it's going to be Vladimir. That's just due to the fact that this comp really enjoys the augments that Vladimir gives. Again, this comp is a lot about, being tanky, and you want to kind of live with the 7 Shurima. So Transfusion ends up working out really well, giving Azir more time to ramp up. And then, of course, the extra HP the units will get after off of Ascending will scale off of the Transfusion extra HP, so it has good synergy there. And then Ascension's also really good. You're running Transfusion with this tanky 7 Shurima composition. Your units will get to the Ascension, and they'll be able to clean up at the end of the fight once your Azir has his Rageblade and Archangel stacked up. So I think Vladimir is the best legend for this board. In addition, you can opt to throw extra mana items on your Cassante if you manage to get to him. Stuff like Blue Buff, Vow, and Chalice is going to be good on him. He's pretty solid in this composition because he'll be pretty tanky with the 7 Shurima. He's a bit worse than he is in 6 Bastion, but he's like not a joke in this composition because a lot of times Cassante is a joke, but with the 7 Shurima, he's actually decently tanky, so he ends up putting up a decent amount of work. If you made it to the end, I want to thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this content, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.